Well, so one area that I think is underappreciated, even by librarians, is the extent to which the moral authority of the librarian to intervene in areas where the network freedom is challenged by copyright, by fears about terrorism or pornography or what have you. Their moral authority to intervene on behalf of the internet is unimpeachable. So at the United Nations and in other fora where librarians come forward and say you mustn't spy on our patrons, you mustn't restrict how the internet works and so on, it's incredibly powerful. But to be really frank, you look like a jerk when you say librarians are bad people. So everyone likes librarians. So this is a vastly underappreciated piece of what the ALA does, especially. The people on the policy side in DC and in Geneva for the ALA and for IFLA and for EIFL are terrific. Without reproach. I mean, just absolutely wonderful. Now, I think that in librarian communities, there's been a certain amount of reactionary fear of the internet, unfortunately, as a source of diffused authority where it's hard to know what information to trust and what information not to trust. Publication has been an imperfect but useful rule of thumb for is this work worth paying attention to. It's because you required so much investment to get a book into print, even if you were doing it on your own. You kind of assume that anyone who made a book available had thought about what was between its covers, whereas it takes an instant and no money at all to make something published on the internet. So there's a mistrust of the internet and a kind of general librarian's lament that goes, oh, they think that everything on the internet is true. Now, in terms of teaching media literacy, I think that's something that librarians have always done and which they can continue to do. One of the things that the internet has done is highlighted the extent to which the material that we trusted because it was in print was no more trustworthy in some ways than the material we find on the internet. I mean, as Jimmy Wales from Wikipedia says, I've never opened the New York Times and found an article with a little box next to it that says 9 out of 10 of the reporters in the newsroom thought that this was bullshit, but the editor ran it anyways. And yet, as someone who's written for the New York Times, I can tell you that happens. On Wikipedia, you find that notice or one like it all the time. On a one-to-one basis, librarians have a tremendous role in teaching people to understand how the network works, how to find alternate sources of information, how to cross-check information, how to trace down rumors, and how to understand how to personally construct the heuristics that you use to determine what's true or what's trustworthy or what's useful. On a broader level, in terms of what library schools can teach and what librarians who are involved in academic librarianship or research or who are doing more than going beyond just the collection and the patron interaction, there's a huge role for changing the way that browsers work so that they become tools of media literacy. For example, imagine something that every time you loaded a Wikipedia page, looked at the history and counted how frequently it had been edited in the last 24 hours, 36, 72, changed the background color of the page based on how controversial it was at that moment. So that at a kind of subliminal level, there was a constant reminder about what was going on. I had a friend from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation who asked me what he thought a public broadcaster could do to cover the upcoming elections, a couple of elections ago in Canada. And I said, well, there's no shortage of news stories about what facts have unraveled as the election proceeds. But context is really hard to frame around it. And yet there's all these government feeds. What if you guys put together a browser plugin that every time you loaded a web page that had a name of a Canadian politician, put a little pop-up over that name that you could mouse over that had the names of everyone who'd been a major donor to that politician's campaign? And what if it also looked for the names of major donors and did a pop-up with all the politicians they contributed to? And that way it wouldn't matter if you were looking at the Globe and Mail's website or even the New York Times reporting on the Canadian election, you would get this information back that would frame it in a way that was part of your own media literacy. So I think that there's a lot of role for librarians in helping people understand how to curate their own collection of information out there on the internet, both within the library and outside. In this vein of really cool browser tricks that librarians have done, in the UK there's a librarian who wrote a browser plugin that adds a button to every Amazon webpage you look at that is reserve this at your local library. Buy with one click, reserve at your local library. How totally cool is that?